Your gloomy face ruins everything, my granddaughter whispered as she pushed me toward the last row of the church, her hand firm against my elbow, her smile still perfectly in place for anyone watching. And in that moment, standing there beneath the stained glass windows of St. Andrew's, I realized something had shifted in a way that would never shift back. I didn't argue. I didn't ask her what she meant. I simply nodded, as if she had asked me to pass the collection basket instead of quietly removing me from my own family's presence, and I walked to the back pew alone. The wood felt colder there, harder somehow, as if even the bench understood I no longer belonged in the front where I had sat every Sunday for over 40 years. I folded my hands in my lap and looked straight ahead, keeping my face still, because I had learned long ago that dignity is often just silence dressed properly. Around me, the soft murmur of the congregation filled the air, familiar voices, gentle greetings, the shuffle of polished shoes against tile, but none of it reached me the way it used to. I could still see them from where I sat, my son Daniel in his navy suit, his posture straight, his attention fixed forward as if nothing unusual had happened, and beside him, Melissa, my daughter-in-law, poised and composed, her blonde hair catching the morning light just right, the picture of grace she had spent years perfecting. Chloe sat next to her, her expression serene now, as if the girl who had just spoken those words to me didn't exist, as if she hadn't just decided that my presence was something to be managed, adjusted, hidden. For a moment, I let myself remember a different Sunday, one from years ago, when Chloe was no more than 5 years old, her small hand wrapped around mine as we walked up those same steps together, her voice bright and full of questions about the colors in the windows, about why people knelt, about whether God could hear her if she whispered. I had knelt beside her then, guiding her gently, teaching her the rhythm of faith, the quiet reverence of the space, believing I was passing something meaningful down to her. I had been the one who woke early to dress her for service when Melissa said she was too busy, the one who packed snacks in my purse for after, the one who listened when Chloe told me about her week in that earnest, breathless way children have. And now, here I was, being repositioned like an extra chair that didn't quite fit the arrangement. The organ began to play, low and steady, the opening notes of a hymn I knew by heart, and the congregation rose together, a synchronized movement that used to feel comforting, grounding, but today it felt like watching a performance I no longer had a role in. I stood as well, slower than I used to, my knees reminding me of my age in ways I could no longer ignore, but I kept my posture straight, my chin level, because there are some habits that don't leave you, no matter how the world around you changes. As the voices lifted in song, I glanced once more toward the front, toward the family I had spent a lifetime building, and I noticed something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. The way Melissa leaned slightly toward Daniel, speaking softly into his ear, the way Chloe's attention drifted not toward the altar but toward the people around her, scanning, observing, calculating in a way that didn't belong to the little girl I remembered. It wasn't just that I had been moved to the back. It was that they had already moved on without me, quietly, efficiently, as if this arrangement had been decided long before today. I lowered my gaze to the worn pages of the hymnal in my hands, tracing the edges of the paper with my thumb, and for the first time, I felt something other than hurt. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was clarity, sharp and undeniable, settling into place like the final piece of a puzzle I hadn't realized I was solving. Because the truth was, moments like this don't happen in isolation. They are built slowly, carefully, over time, in small decisions, in overlooked comments, in shifts so subtle you convince yourself they don't mean anything until suddenly they mean everything. I thought about the past few months, about the conversations that ended a little too quickly when I entered the room, about the invitations that stopped coming unless I asked first, about the way decisions were made and presented to me as if my agreement were assumed but not required. I had told myself it was just life-changing, that people get busy, that families evolve, but sitting there in that last row, I understood that evolution can also mean exclusion. The hymn ended, and the congregation settled back into their seats, a soft rustle of fabric and wood, and I followed, smoothing my skirt over my knees, my movements precise, controlled. Up front, Melissa adjusted something on Chloe's sleeve, a small, careful gesture, and Chloe smiled at her, warm and effortless, a smile I realized I hadn't seen directed at me in a very long time. I exhaled slowly, keeping my expression neutral, my breathing even, because there is a certain kind of strength in not reacting, in allowing the moment to pass without giving it the satisfaction of breaking you. But beneath that calm, something had shifted, something steady and unyielding taking root where confusion used to be. I didn't know yet what I would do with that understanding, how I would respond to what had just happened, but I knew this much with absolute certainty. The woman who had walked into this church an hour ago, expecting to sit beside her family, was not the same woman sitting here now in the last row, watching them from a distance they had chosen for her, and that difference was not something that could be undone. I stayed through the rest of the service without moving again, even when my legs began to ache and the wooden pew pressed against my back in a way that made me aware of every year I had lived, because leaving early would have meant acknowledging what had happened, and I was not ready to give it that kind of weight, not yet. When the final hymn ended and the congregation began to file out, I waited, letting others pass me, exchanging polite smiles with people who had known me for decades, people who still greeted me warmly, who still saw me as I had always been, and for a moment that almost made it worse, because it reminded me that whatever had changed was not the world, it was my place in it. Outside, the late morning sun was bright, the kind that made everything look softer than it really was, and I stepped onto the stone walkway, pausing just long enough to steady myself before moving toward the small groups gathering on the lawn. I could hear familiar laughter, the easy rhythm of conversations about grandchildren, about weekend plans, about things that once would have included me without question, and I felt that same quiet distance settle over me again, like I was standing just a few feet outside of something I used to belong to. I spotted Daniel first, his hand resting lightly on Melissa's back as they spoke with another couple, his posture relaxed, his expression attentive, and Chloe stood just beside them, scrolling through her phone for a moment before slipping it into her purse and stepping closer to join the conversation, her smile returning seamlessly as if it had never left. For a brief second, I considered walking over, taking my usual place beside them, allowing everything to continue as if nothing had happened, but something in me held back, a quiet instinct that told me I needed to watch instead of step in. So I stayed where I was, near the edge of the walkway, pretending to adjust the strap of my purse while my eyes remained on them, not staring, not making it obvious, just observing in the way you do when you're trying to understand something that does not quite make sense yet. It did not take long before I noticed the pattern, the small, almost invisible movements that revealed more than any words could. Melissa was the one guiding the interactions, subtly deciding who they spoke to, when they moved on, how long they stayed, her hand occasionally brushing Daniel's arm to redirect him, her glance toward Chloe enough to signal when it was time to smile, to laugh, to engage. Chloe followed those cues effortlessly, her responses timed just right, her tone light and agreeable, and Daniel, whether he realized it or not, adjusted himself around them, aligning with their rhythm instead of setting his own. I had seen Melissa manage situations before, of course, organizing family dinners, planning holidays, making decisions that kept things running smoothly, and I had once appreciated that about her, believing it was a strength that complemented our family. But standing there now, watching from a distance I had not chosen, I began to see something else beneath it, something more controlled, more deliberate, like every interaction was being shaped to present a certain image, one that did not include me unless it was convenient. I shifted my weight slightly, the gravel crunching softly beneath my shoes, and that was when I heard my name, not called out to me, but spoken just within earshot, quiet enough to suggest it was not meant for me to hear, but not so quiet that it could not be. She looked so out of place today, Chloe said, her voice carrying just enough in the still air, and I felt something tighten in my chest, not sharp, not overwhelming, just a steady pressure that made it harder to ignore what was unfolding. Melissa responded with a soft laugh, the kind that could be mistaken for gentle if you did not listen closely, and she said something I could not fully catch, but I heard enough to understand the tone, enough to know it was not concern, not kindness, but something closer to dismissal. Daniel did not speak, not that I could hear, and that silence said more than anything else could have. I turned my gaze away then, focusing instead on the line of trees along the edge of the parking lot, their leaves shifting slightly in the breeze, the sunlight filtering through in a way that made everything look calm, undisturbed, as if nothing significant had happened at all. But inside, the clarity I had felt earlier was deepening, settling into something more solid, more certain, because this was not a misunderstanding, not a single careless moment that could be explained away. It was a pattern, one that had been forming quietly, consistently, until it reached a point where it no longer needed to be hidden. I took a slow breath, letting it out carefully, and adjusted my purse strap once more before beginning to walk toward my car. Not hurried, not hesitant, just steady, because there is a difference between walking away and stepping back, and I was beginning to understand which one this needed to be. As I reached the edge of the lot, I glanced back one last time, not out of longing, but out of recognition, taking in the scene as it was now, not as I had once believed it to be, and I realized that whatever came next would not be decided in moments like this, out in the open, surrounded by polite smiles and quiet conversations. It would be decided elsewhere, in the spaces where truth did not need to be softened, where decisions could be made without performance. And as I opened my car door and slid into the driver's seat, closing it with a soft, final sound, I understood that this was only the beginning of something I had not yet fully seen, but was finally ready to face. The drive home felt longer than usual, even though the route had not changed in over 20 years, every turn familiar, every stoplight predictable. Yet something about the silence inside the car made the distance stretch in a way that had nothing to do with miles and everything to do with what I could no longer ignore. I kept my hands steady on the steering wheel, my posture upright, my eyes focused on the road ahead, because it was easier to concentrate on something concrete than to let my thoughts wander too freely into places that were beginning to take shape, whether I welcomed them or not. When I pulled into my driveway, the house greeted me the same way it always had. Quiet, orderly, unchanged from the outside, the white siding still clean, the front garden still carefully maintained, the small details I had spent years tending to still in place, as if nothing in my life had shifted. I stepped inside, closing the door gently behind me, and for a moment I stood there in the entryway, letting the stillness settle around me, the kind of stillness that used to feel peaceful, but now felt like it was waiting for something I had not yet said out loud. I set my purse on the small table by the door, removed my shoes with deliberate care, and walked into the living room where the sunlight filtered through the curtains in thin, soft lines across the hardwood floor. Everything was exactly where it had always been. The framed photographs on the mantel, the armchair by the window, the books stacked neatly on the side table. And yet as I moved through the space, I began to see it differently, not as a place filled with memories, but as a place filled with evidence. I paused in front of one of the photographs, the one taken nearly 15 years ago, Chloe standing between Daniel and me, her smile wide and unguarded, her small hands gripping ours as if we were the center of her world, and I studied that image longer than I had in years, searching for the moment when that connection had started to loosen, when something had begun to shift beneath the surface without my noticing. It would be easy to say it happened suddenly, to point to one event or one decision. But the truth rarely works that way, and deep down I knew that what I had seen this morning was not the beginning of anything. It was the result of something that had been building quietly, patiently, in the background of everyday life. I moved away from the mantel and into the kitchen, filling a glass with water and taking a slow sip, letting the coolness ground me as I leaned lightly against the counter. My mind began to retrace the past year, not in broad strokes, but in small, precise details that had once seemed insignificant. The dinners that had been rescheduled at the last minute, the holidays that had somehow become smaller, more selective, the conversations that shifted direction when I entered the room, the decisions that were presented to me after they had already been made. At the time, I had accepted each of those moments as part of life changing, as people becoming busier, more independent, more focused on their own routines, and I had told myself that it was natural, that it was something to be understood rather than questioned. But standing there now, in the quiet of my own kitchen, I began to see those moments differently, not as isolated incidents, but as pieces of a larger pattern that had been forming without interruption. I set the glass down and walked over to the small desk by the window, the one I used for bills and correspondence, and I opened the top drawer, pulling out a neatly organized stack of envelopes and documents. I had always been careful with these things, always kept records, always made sure everything was in order, because it was how I maintained a sense of control over at least one part of my life. As I flipped through the papers, I noticed something I had overlooked before, small inconsistencies that I had dismissed at the time, but now stood out with a clarity that was impossible to ignore. A statement that had been forwarded instead of sent directly, a signature that looked slightly different than I remembered, a document that had been explained to me quickly and then filed away without much discussion. None of it had seemed urgent then, nothing that required more than a brief question or a passing thought. But now, with everything else beginning to align, those details felt less like coincidences and more like signals I had not been ready to read. I sat down slowly in the chair, the papers still in my hands, and allowed myself to consider something I had resisted until now, not because it was impossible, but because it was uncomfortable in a way that challenged everything I had believed about my own family. What if the distance I had been feeling was not accidental? What if the changes I had noticed were not simply the result of time passing? What if there was intention behind it, quiet, careful, deliberate intention that had shaped the way things had unfolded over the past months? I did not rush to answer those questions, because I understood that answers, once accepted, have a way of changing everything that follows. Instead, I placed the papers back in the drawer, closed it gently, and rested my hands on the desk, my fingers lightly touching the smooth surface as I looked out the window at the stillness of the street beyond. For the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge that what I had witnessed that morning was not just a moment of disrespect. It was a glimpse into something much deeper, something that had been carefully constructed over time, and as that realization settled into place, steady and undeniable, I felt the same quiet shift within me that I had felt in the last row of that church. Only now it was stronger, more defined, less uncertain. I was not confused anymore. I was beginning to understand, and understanding, I had learned, is where everything begins to change. That afternoon, I did not turn on the television, and I did not reach for the phone the way I sometimes did when the quiet stretched too long, because there was something else I needed to sit with, something that required more attention than distraction could offer. I moved slowly through the house, not out of fatigue, but out of intention, letting my eyes rest on the details I had once passed by without thought, the small arrangements, the choices that had shaped this place over the years, each one tied to a memory that now felt less like comfort and more like a question waiting to be answered. In the hallway, I paused again at another photograph, this one taken at Daniel's wedding. Melissa standing beside him in a white dress that had drawn admiration from everyone in the room, her smile radiant, her posture composed, her presence immediately commanding in a way that had impressed me at the time. I remembered how grateful I had felt that day, believing my son had chosen someone capable, someone who would bring stability and care into his life, someone who would value the family she was joining. I had welcomed her without hesitation, offered support without conditions, and over time, I had stepped back in ways that felt respectful, allowing her to take the lead in decisions that shaped their household, trusting that her intentions were aligned with ours. But as I stood there now, looking at that frozen moment in time, I realized that what I had seen as confidence might have been something else entirely, something more calculated, something that understood influence long before I understood its presence. I turned away from the photograph and continued into the study, a room that had once belonged to my husband, where his desk still stood exactly as he had left it, the surface polished, the drawers organized, his sense of order preserved in a way that made it feel as though he had only stepped out for a moment. I sat down in his chair, letting my hands rest lightly on the wood, and allowed myself to think about the years after he passed, about how much had changed in ways I had not fully acknowledged. Daniel had stepped into a different role then, one that required him to manage more, to make decisions quickly, to rely on Melissa in ways that made sense at the time, and I had supported that shift, believing it was necessary, believing it was temporary. But temporary changes have a way of becoming permanent when no one questions them. And I had not questioned them. Not when Melissa began handling more of the financial conversations, not when documents were brought to me with explanations that were brief but confident, not when decisions were presented as already finalized. I had trusted them, not blindly, but willingly, because trust is easier than doubt when it comes to family. I leaned back slightly in the chair and closed my eyes for a moment, not to rest, but to listen to the quiet in a different way, to allow the connections to form without interruption. When I opened them again, my gaze settled on the filing cabinet in the corner, the one that held records I had not reviewed in detail for some time, and I stood, crossing the room with a steadiness that felt new, not rushed, not uncertain, but deliberate. I opened the top drawer and began to sort through the folders, each labeled carefully, each containing pieces of a life that had once felt entirely transparent. As I moved from one file to the next, I noticed how certain documents had been grouped differently than I remembered, how some correspondence had been redirected, how signatures appeared where I did not recall placing them myself. None of it was overtly alarming, nothing that would raise immediate concern to someone not looking closely. But I was looking closely now, and what I saw was not disorder, but design. I took one folder and placed it on the desk, opening it slowly, reviewing its contents with a level of attention I had not applied before, and with each page, the sense of clarity I had begun to feel earlier became more defined. This was not about a single moment at church, not about a whispered comment or a change in seating. It was about a pattern of control that had extended into areas I had assumed were still mine, decisions that had been guided in directions I had not chosen, information that had been filtered before it reached me. I closed the folder carefully and returned it to its place, not because I was finished, but because I understood that this was only the beginning of what I needed to examine. I moved back toward the desk and sat down again, my hands resting calmly in front of me, and for the first time since that morning, I allowed myself to consider not just what had been done, but what I would do in response. I did not feel anger rising, not in the way I might have expected, because anger is often loud and immediate, and what I felt was neither of those things. It was quieter, more measured, a kind of resolve that did not demand attention, but held it nonetheless. I looked around the room once more, at the space that had once been shared, at the life that had been built with care and intention, and I understood that whatever had been taken from me had not been taken all at once. It had been adjusted, redirected, gradually moved until I found myself standing outside of it without realizing how I had gotten there. That understanding did not weaken me. It steadied me, because it meant that just as things had been changed over time, they could be changed again, not through confrontation, not through raised voices or sudden reactions, but through decisions made with the same quiet precision I had just begun to recognize. I folded my hands together and sat there in the stillness, not waiting, not hesitating, but preparing in a way that did not require urgency, only clarity, and for the first time, I felt certain that I was no longer reacting to what had been done. I was beginning to decide what would happen next. The following morning, I woke earlier than usual, not because I had slept well, but because something in my mind had settled into a quiet rhythm that no longer allowed me to drift comfortably between thoughts, and instead urged me forward with a sense of purpose I had not felt in quite some time. The house was still dark when I stepped into the kitchen, the clock on the wall reading just past 6, and I moved through my usual routine without hesitation, brewing coffee, setting a single cup on the counter, and standing there as the machine hummed softly in the background. It was a familiar routine, one I had followed for years, but this morning it felt different, not because the actions had changed, but because the way I experienced them had shifted, each movement deliberate, each decision made with awareness instead of habit. I carried my coffee to the small table by the window and sat down, looking out at the quiet street as the first light of day began to stretch across the pavement. And for a moment I allowed myself to simply observe, to let the stillness exist without filling it with unnecessary thought. But the clarity I had reached the day before did not fade with the night. It remained, steady and present, guiding the way my mind returned to the details I had begun to uncover. After a few minutes, I stood and walked back to the study, opening the filing cabinet once more, this time not with hesitation, but with intention. I selected a different set of folders, ones related to property records and account summaries, and carried them to the desk, arranging them neatly before sitting down again. As I reviewed each document, I paid attention not only to the information itself, but to the sequence in which it had been presented to me over the past year, reconstructing the timeline in a way I had not done before. It became clear that certain decisions had not only been guided, but subtly directed, framed in ways that made them appear beneficial or necessary, while limiting the opportunity for me to question them fully. I remembered specific conversations, brief and efficient, where Melissa had explained changes in terms that sounded reasonable at the time, where Daniel had nodded in agreement, reinforcing the sense that everything was under control, and where I had accepted those explanations without pressing further, trusting that I was being kept informed. But now, looking at the documents in front of me, I could see the gaps between what had been said and what had actually been done, small discrepancies that had gone unnoticed because they were never presented together, never aligned in a way that revealed their full meaning. I placed one document aside and reached for another, comparing dates, signatures, and notes in the margins, and with each comparison, the pattern became more defined. It was not chaotic or careless. It was organized, intentional, and most importantly, consistent. I sat back in the chair and exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in acknowledgement of what I was seeing, because understanding something clearly requires a willingness to accept it without resistance. For a long time, I had believed that my role in this family had simply changed with time, that I had moved from being central to being supportive, from leading to observing, and I had accepted that transition with grace, believing it was part of the natural progression of life. But what I was beginning to understand now was that this change had not been entirely natural. It had been shaped, guided in a specific direction, one that gradually reduced my involvement while maintaining the appearance of inclusion. I stood and walked to the window, holding one of the documents loosely in my hand, and looked out at the quiet neighborhood as the morning fully arrived, the sun now higher, the street beginning to show signs of life. It would have been easy, at that moment, to feel overwhelmed, to allow the weight of what I had discovered to settle into something heavy and difficult to carry. But instead, I felt something else, something steadier, something that did not pull me down but held me upright. Because clarity, even when it reveals uncomfortable truths, has a way of restoring balance, of giving you a foundation to stand on when everything else feels uncertain. I turned back to the desk and placed the document carefully with the others, aligning them into a neat stack. And as I did, I began to think not about what had already been done, but about what remained within my control. There were still decisions that required my signature, still accounts that were in my name, still elements of my life that had not been fully shifted away from me, and that realization carried with it a quiet sense of possibility. I did not need to confront anyone immediately. I did not need to announce what I had discovered or demand explanations that would likely be shaped in the same careful way everything else had been. What I needed, more than anything, was to understand the full scope of the situation before making a move. I gathered the documents together and returned them to their place, closing the drawer with a soft, controlled motion, and then I remained standing there for a moment, my hand resting lightly against the cabinet. The plan was not yet complete, not fully formed, but the direction was clear, and that was enough for now. I stepped out of the study and into the hallway, moving through the house with the same calm precision that had guided me all morning, and as I passed the photographs on the wall once more, I did not stop this time. I did not need to look at them again to understand what they represented. I already knew. What mattered now was what I would choose to do with that understanding, and for the first time, I felt ready to begin. That same afternoon, I made a decision that would have seemed unnecessary just a few days ago, but now felt as natural as breathing. And I reached for my phone not to call Daniel, not to ask questions that would only lead to carefully measured answers, but to contact someone who had always dealt in facts rather than appearances. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I was looking for, a number I had not used in over a year, and I pressed call without hesitation, holding the phone to my ear as it rang. When his voice came through, steady and professional, it felt like stepping into a different kind of space, one where things were defined clearly, where explanations were expected to match reality. "This is Martin Reynolds," he said, and I allowed myself a small pause before responding, not out of uncertainty, but out of awareness that this conversation marked the beginning of something I could not undo. "Martin, this is Eleanor Whitmore," I said, my tone calm, even, the same tone I had used in situations that required composure above all else. There was a brief silence on the other end, followed by recognition. "Mrs. Whitmore, it has been a while. How can I help you?" I did not rush into the details. Instead, I chose my words carefully, because clarity begins with precision. I would like to schedule a time to review my financial documents and estate arrangements, I said. In person. There was no hesitation in his response. Of course, I can make time this week. Does Thursday morning work for you? I glanced at the calendar on the wall, though I already knew my schedule was clear. Thursday morning is fine, I replied. 10 o'clock. We confirmed the details, and when the call ended, I set the phone down on the table with the same controlled motion I had used all day, as if each action needed to reflect the steadiness I was beginning to feel internally. I did not feel anxious. I did not feel rushed. What I felt was alignment, as though the pieces that had been scattered were now beginning to move into place, guided by intention rather than assumption. I spent the next few hours gathering what I would need, not everything, not yet, but enough to begin asking the right questions. I returned to the study and opened the filing cabinet once more, selecting specific folders, reviewing them again with a sharper focus, marking certain pages with small slips of paper so I could return to them quickly. Each document I handled no longer felt like a passive record of the past, but like a piece of evidence that required understanding. As I worked, I noticed how my perspective had shifted completely. Where I had once accepted explanations at face value, I now examined them, considering not just what was said, but what had been left unsaid. Where I had once assumed decisions were made in my best interest, I now asked whether those decisions had truly required my absence from the process. By the time the sun began to lower in the sky, casting longer shadows across the room, I had organized everything into a single, structured set of questions, not written down, but clear in my mind, each one connected to something I had seen, something I had remembered, something I had begun to understand. I closed the final folder and placed it neatly with the others, then stood and walked through the house once more, not out of restlessness, but out of recognition. This space, this life, these routines, they were still mine, but they had been quietly adjusted around me in ways I had not fully acknowledged until now. In the kitchen, I prepared a simple dinner, moving through each step with the same calm precision, and as I sat down to eat, I allowed myself a moment to reflect, not on what had been taken, but on what remained. Control is rarely lost all at once. It is given away in small moments of trust, in decisions not questioned, in assumptions not challenged, and while I could not change the past, I could change what happened next. After dinner, I cleaned up as I always did, leaving everything in its place, maintaining the order that had always been important to me, but now that order carried a different meaning. It was no longer just about keeping things tidy. It was about preparing for what was coming. Later that evening, as I sat in the living room with a book open in my hands, I realized I had not read a single word on the page, not because I was distracted, but because my focus had shifted entirely. I was no longer looking outward, waiting for things to happen, waiting for explanations or apologies that might never come. I was looking inward, organizing my thoughts, aligning my actions, preparing quietly for a conversation that would not be based on emotion, but on clarity. When I finally set the book aside and turned off the light, the house returned to its familiar stillness, but it no longer felt empty or uncertain. It felt contained, controlled, as if everything within it was exactly where it needed to be, including me. And as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I understood that whatever answers I would receive on Thursday would not create this change. They would only confirm it. The real shift had already happened, not in the church, not in a whispered comment, but in the moment I chose to stop accepting what I was given and start understanding what was actually mine. Thursday morning arrived with a kind of quiet certainty that made everything feel sharper, more defined, as if the world itself had aligned with the decision I had already made days before, and I woke before the alarm, sitting up in bed for a moment without moving, letting that stillness settle into me before I began. I dressed carefully, choosing a navy blouse and a structured coat that fit just right, not because anyone had asked me to present myself a certain way, but because I understood that presentation is often the first statement you make before you say a single word. When I looked at my reflection in the mirror, I did not search for reassurance. I simply observed, taking in the woman looking back at me with a clarity I had not allowed myself in years, and for the first time, I did not see someone who had been quietly set aside. I saw someone who had been watching, learning, and now preparing to act. The drive to Martin's office was calm, the roads familiar, the traffic light. And when I parked outside the building, I took a moment before stepping out of the car, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness that this was where things would begin to move from understanding into action. The office itself had not changed. The same polished floors, the same understated decor, the same quiet professionalism that had always defined the space. And when I stepped inside, the receptionist greeted me with a polite smile, directing me toward the conference room, where Martin was already waiting. He stood as I entered, offering a firm handshake and a respectful nod, and there was something grounding about his presence, something that did not shift or adjust depending on who else was in the room. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, gesturing toward the chair across from him. "Please have a seat." I did, placing my folder neatly on the table before me, my movements steady, controlled, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, allowing the quiet to settle naturally before the conversation began. "You mentioned you wanted to review your financial and estate arrangements," he said finally, his tone measured, direct. "Is there something specific you are concerned about?" I did not answer immediately. Instead, I opened the folder and slid a few documents toward him, aligning them carefully before looking up. "I would like you to walk me through these," I said, my voice calm, precise. "Step by step." He glanced down at the papers, his expression shifting slightly, not in alarm, but in recognition that this was not a routine review. As he began to speak, explaining the structure, the accounts, the changes that had been made over time, I listened without interruption, following each detail, each connection, each decision that had been documented. At certain points, I asked questions, not many, but enough to clarify what I needed to understand, and each answer added another layer to the picture that had already begun to form in my mind. It did not take long before the pattern became undeniable, not just in theory, but in fact, laid out clearly in terms that could not be softened or reinterpreted. There were adjustments that had been made with my consent, yes, but there were also decisions that had been influenced in ways that were not fully disclosed, processes that had been guided without my full awareness of their implications. Martin paused at one point, looking at me carefully before speaking again. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, choosing his words with professional caution, "based on what I am seeing, it would be advisable to reassess certain authorizations and access points, particularly regarding who is permitted to act on your behalf." I met his gaze without hesitation. "That is exactly why I am here," I replied. There was no anger in my voice, no trace of accusation, only clarity, and I could see in his expression that he understood the difference. We spent the next hour going through each element in detail, identifying what needed to be adjusted, what could be restricted, what should be restructured entirely, and as we did, I felt something settle into place within me, not a sense of victory, but a sense of restoration, as though I was reclaiming something that had never truly been meant to leave my control. When the discussion turned to my estate, Martin outlined the current structure, the beneficiaries, the provisions that had been put in place over the years, and I listened carefully, considering each part not just as it existed, but as it would function moving forward. "If you wish to make changes," he said, "we can begin drafting revisions immediately." I folded my hands lightly on the table, taking a brief moment before responding, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted my decision to be deliberate, unmistakable. "We will make changes," I said, "but not all at once." He nodded, understanding without requiring further explanation, and together we outlined the first steps, not drastic, not obvious, but precise, adjustments that would begin to shift the balance quietly, without drawing attention before the right time. When the meeting concluded, I gathered my documents and stood, thanking him with the same composed tone I had maintained throughout. And as I walked out of the office and into the daylight, I realized that something fundamental had already changed. I was no longer observing from a distance, no longer piecing together fragments after the fact. I was now part of the process again, actively shaping what would come next. And as I returned to my car, unlocking the door with a steady hand, I understood that whatever they believed about me, whatever assumptions they had made, they were about to learn something they had not expected. I had not been removed. I had simply been waiting. The days that followed did not feel rushed or uncertain, and that, more than anything, told me I was moving in the right direction, because for the first time in a long while, I was no longer reacting to what others had arranged around me. I was deciding what would remain and what would quietly change. I returned home from the meeting with Martin and placed my folder back into the study, not hidden, not locked away, but positioned exactly where I could access it when needed, a quiet reminder that the process had already begun. I did not call Daniel. I did not send a message to Melissa. I did not reach out to Chloe. Silence, I had come to understand, was not always absence. Sometimes it was space, carefully maintained until the right moment arrived. By Saturday afternoon, I received a message from Melissa, brief and pleasant in tone, inviting me to Sunday lunch at their house, the kind of invitation that, on the surface, appeared thoughtful, considerate, as if nothing had shifted at all. I read it once, then again, not for what it said, but for how it was said, and I could almost hear her voice behind the words, composed, controlled, expecting agreement without resistance. I replied simply that I would be there. The next morning, I prepared as I always did, choosing my outfit with care, not out of vanity, but out of intention, and when I arrived at their home, everything appeared exactly as it should. The front yard was trimmed, the windows clean, the door opening before I even reached it as Melissa greeted me with a warm smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Eleanor, I am so glad you could make it," she said, stepping aside to let me in, her tone effortless, practiced. I stepped into the house, taking in the familiar arrangement, the subtle changes that had been made over time, the small details that reflected her influence in ways I had once admired. Daniel appeared from the living room, his expression relaxed, his voice easy as he greeted me, and Chloe followed shortly after, her posture straight, her smile polite, as though nothing had ever been out of place between us. I returned their greetings with the same calm composure I had carried all week, not cold, not distant, simply steady, allowing the moment to unfold without interference. Lunch was set neatly on the table, each place arranged with care, and as we sat down together, the conversation moved easily at first, light topics, familiar rhythms, the kind of exchange that could almost convince someone that everything was exactly as it had always been. But I was no longer listening the way I used to. I was observing, noticing how decisions were made even in small moments, how Melissa guided the flow of conversation, how Daniel deferred without realizing it, how Chloe mirrored the tone set around her. At one point, Melissa reached for a dish and passed it to Daniel before it had even been offered to me. A small gesture, barely noticeable, but I saw it clearly, the kind of detail that once would have slipped by without meaning, but now stood out with quiet significance. I did not comment. I did not interrupt. I simply noted it, adding it to the understanding I had been building piece by piece. As the meal continued, Daniel mentioned something about upcoming financial planning, a casual remark, the kind that would normally pass without much thought. But this time, I paid attention to the way he phrased it, the assumptions embedded in his words, the way he spoke as though certain decisions were already in motion. "We were thinking it might be a good idea to consolidate a few things moving forward," he said, glancing briefly at Melissa before looking back at me, and I recognized the pattern immediately, the same structure I had seen in documents, in conversations, in the quiet adjustments that had shaped my position without my full awareness. I set my fork down gently, not making a sound, and looked at him with a calm expression that gave nothing away. "That sounds like something worth discussing in detail," I said, my tone even, measured. Melissa smiled slightly, her expression unchanged, but I saw the brief pause in her movement, the smallest shift that suggested she had not expected that response. "Of course," she replied, her voice smooth. "We can go over everything together soon." I nodded, not agreeing, not disagreeing, simply acknowledging the statement, and the conversation moved on, returning to safer topics, but the dynamic had shifted, just enough to be felt beneath the surface. When lunch ended, I stood and thanked Melissa for the meal, my words polite, my tone consistent, and as I prepared to leave, Chloe walked me to the door, her steps measured, her expression composed. For a moment, we stood there in the entryway, the distance between us small, but no longer familiar, and she looked at me as though she expected something, perhaps a comment, perhaps a reaction, something that would restore the balance she understood. But I gave her nothing of the sort. I simply met her gaze calmly and said goodbye, my voice steady, my posture unchanged. As I stepped outside and made my way back to my car, I did not feel the weight I might have felt before. I did not feel dismissed or excluded. What I felt was clarity, reinforced, confirmed, strengthened by what I had just observed. They were continuing exactly as they had been, moving forward with the same quiet confidence, the same assumptions, the same belief that nothing had shifted beyond their control. And as I drove away, my hands steady on the wheel, my eyes focused ahead, I understood something with absolute certainty. They still believed they were in control of the narrative. They just did not realize that the story had already begun to change. On Monday morning, I returned to the study with a sense of calm that no longer needed reinforcement, because what I had observed the day before had confirmed everything I needed to know, and what remained was not discovery, but execution. I opened the drawer and took out the documents Martin and I had discussed, placing them carefully on the desk, each page aligned, each decision already made in my mind before the pen ever touched the paper. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that allows clarity to exist without interruption, and as I reviewed the revisions one final time, I did not feel hesitation, only precision. The authorizations had been adjusted, access had been limited, and certain permissions that had once been extended without question were now withdrawn, not dramatically, not in a way that would immediately draw attention, but in a way that would shift control back into its proper place. I signed each document slowly, deliberately, my signature steady, unchanged, a small but final confirmation that what had been set in motion would not be reversed. When I finished, I gathered the papers into a single folder and set them aside, not hidden, not concealed, but no longer vulnerable to casual handling or quiet alteration. Later that week, I received a call from Daniel, his tone light, conversational, as if nothing had changed, as if the patterns I had seen had not existed at all. "Mom, I was thinking we could sit down this weekend and go over a few things," he said, and I recognized the structure immediately, the same careful framing, the same assumption that the conversation would follow a familiar path. I listened, without interrupting, allowing him to finish, and when he did, I responded with the same calm clarity that had guided me all week. "That will not be necessary," I said, my voice even, without emphasis, without resistance. There was a pause on the other end of the line, brief but noticeable, and when he spoke again, there was a subtle shift in his tone, something less certain, less assured. "Not necessary," he repeated, as though testing the words. "I have already reviewed everything with Martin," I said, not offering more than that, not explaining beyond what was required. Silence followed, longer this time, and I understood that in that moment, something had begun to register, not fully, not yet, but enough to disrupt the expectation that things would continue as they always had. "Oh," he said finally, the word quiet, controlled. "Well, that is good then." We ended the call shortly after, the conversation closing without resolution, without the usual reassurances, and as I set the phone down, I felt no need to revisit it, no urge to fill in the gaps he had left unspoken. The shift had already begun. Over the next few days, small changes started to surface, not dramatic, not immediate, but noticeable to anyone paying attention. Requests that would have once come through Melissa now paused, redirected, requiring confirmation that no longer came automatically. Documents that had once been handled without question now required verification, signatures that could not be obtained without direct involvement. I did not announce these changes. I did not explain them. I allowed them to exist, to unfold naturally, because control does not need to be declared when it is properly established. By the following Sunday, I returned to church as I always had, arriving at the same time, walking the same path, stepping into the same space that had once felt altered in a way I could not ignore. This time, I did not wait. I moved forward, choosing my seat without hesitation, settling into the front row with the same quiet confidence I had carried all week. There were no objections, no interruptions, only a brief glance from Chloe as she entered with Melissa and Daniel, her expression flickering for just a moment before returning to its composed surface. Melissa's posture remained unchanged, her movements controlled, but I noticed the slight delay, the smallest pause as she adjusted to what she had not anticipated. Daniel looked at me, his expression neutral, but there was something beneath it now, something less certain than before. I did not acknowledge it directly. I did not need to. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, my posture steady, my gaze forward, and as the service began, I felt no distance, No sense of exclusion, only the quiet certainty that I was exactly where I belonged. The room had not changed. The people had not changed. What had changed was my position within it, not because it had been given back to me, but because I had taken it back with the same calm precision with which it had been shifted away. When the service ended and the congregation began to rise, I remained seated for a moment longer, allowing the movement around me to pass without urgency, and then I stood, smoothing my coat with a small, practiced gesture before stepping into the aisle. As I walked forward, past the rows that had once separated me from where I now stood, I understood something with complete clarity. Respect is not maintained by silence when that silence is mistaken for absence. It is maintained by presence, by awareness, by the quiet refusal to be moved without consent. And as I stepped out into the light once more, the same sunlight that had once made everything seem softer than it was, I no longer needed it to soften anything. I saw everything exactly as it was, and for the first time, that was more than enough.